We've talked about this one several times in Luke 14. If you took the passage literally, it would actually be requiring you to do something sinful. Luke 14:26, Jesus said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Hate. That's strong stuff. By the way, I've got a sermon on this. There is a time to hate. Sometimes we act like hate's always wrong. Hate's not always wrong. There is a time to hate. Not here, but there is a time to hate. There are things we should hate. We should hate what? Hate sin, hate evil, things like that. So there is a time to hate. But here he's speaking figuratively, because if you took him literally, hating your father, hating your mother, you end up with a contradiction. And you end up doing something wrong. Because the Bible tells us to do what with our family? To honor them, to honor our parents, and to love our siblings, and to love our brothers and sisters. And so it would be creating a contradiction here, and it would be asking you to do something which is sinful. So clearly it's figurative language, but notice how vivid it is. Hate, that's strong. When you hate something, that's strong language. I hate pickles. That's pretty strong. I hate them. I don't want nothing to do with it. I don't even like the smell of pickles. I hate cottage cheese, okay? But that's strong language. And he's trying to get across a point here about what? Yeah, putting Christ first. Love less is the idea. If you compare it with the parallel account in Matthew 10:37, he who loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So hate is used in the sense of to love less. Your love for God would make your love for mom and dad look like hate, is the idea. And notice how vivid that is. It really gets across the point that God needs to be number one in our life. And he puts it down to the closest relationships you have, your parents and your spouse and your children. These are the closest relationships we have on earth. And he says you've got to hate those people to make the point that God needs to be supreme. Even your own life. And most people, there's within us this survival instinct. We're going to try to live if at all possible. We want to live. We fight for our life. And he says, no, you need to hate your life. So your own life cannot be more important than God. Your own wants can't be more important than God. Your own family can't be more important than God. So you've got a stark figure of speech. That figure, a little bit later on, we're going to be talking about the names for these different figures. They all have names. And this particular one's called a hyperbole. And it means you're exaggerating to make your point. So by means of exaggeration, he shows how great your love for God needs to be. Sometimes we get lucky, and the passage will just come out and tell us it's figurative. Hey, I like that. I like it when God just tells me it's figurative. In John 2, we have an example of this. Jesus cleansed the temple. In Jerusalem, there was the temple that the Jews had built. The first one was built by Solomon, and then it was leveled to the ground by the Babylonians, and then Herod came along later and built the second temple. And I don't think it was quite as grand as Solomon's temple. I think it was a little less grand as Solomon's temple, but it was still a great place. It was the place where the Jews were supposed to go and make their sacrifices to God. That was the place where God was to meet them. And one day Jesus goes in there and there's people buying and selling animals. Now, what they were doing wasn't wrong because the law made provision for that. If you lived a long way from Jerusalem, and you were going to go and sacrifice, you could sell your stock before you left and take the cash in hand instead of having to drive the stock all the way to Jerusalem, and go to Jerusalem and buy stock there. So in other words, you're swapping out your stock for cash, and you're going to Jerusalem and you're going to buy stock in Jerusalem to sacrifice. And the law made provision for that. But the problem was they were doing that transaction in the temple. Big no-no. Do that somewhere else, not in God's house. That was God's dwelling place in a manner of speaking. And so if that little background there, Jesus comes into the temple in John 2, verse 18. Well, let me back up verse 13 where he cleansed it. I know the passage, that it didn't go all the way back to verse 13 on your notes, but just for context, verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple, those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business. What they were doing was not wrong. It was where they were doing it. That's the problem. So he made a whip of cords. People say Jesus never got mad. Jesus was always kind and sweet. Not today. Not today. He made a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. Now, Jesus was a carpenter by trade, and back in those days you didn't have power tools, so a lot of stuff you did with your own manual power. For example, today you chop down a tree with a chainsaw. Back then, and sometimes even today, you use that old crosscut saw. Aaron, that's pretty rough stuff there, isn't it? That old crosscut saw, that's hard work right there. And so Jesus, being a carpenter of that kind, without the power tools, he was probably a little buff. And when he starts turning tables over and cracking the whip, everybody's paying attention. Jesus wasn't no scrawny little girly man. Jesus was kind of big and imposing, and he scared the daylights out of these people. And he says, get these things out of my Father's house. Don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Verse 18, the Jews answered and said, what sign do you show us since you do these things? Who do you think you are doing all this? Turn these tables over, run these people out of here. And he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Well, the Jews says, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. They're talking about Herod's temple. And you're going to raise it up in 3 days? And then John says, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. So right there you get right away when he says destroy this temple, you don't have to wonder what temple he's talking about because John gives you the clue. And he says he's talking about the temple of his body. He's not talking about the temple where they were buying and selling. And he said destroy this temple. And in 3 days I'll raise it up. So he's talking about his resurrection. Yeah. After he's crucified, he said, I'll raise it up. And by the way, that's the sign of Christianity. Resurrection. If the resurrection is false, you may as well throw your Bible in the garbage and go home. But the resurrection, just to be honest about it, is a historical fact. Now, a lot of people don't want to face that fact. They don't want to live it. But the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact attested to by multiple witnesses. Most of those witnesses wrote this. Okay, the people who wrote this are the people who were there, who saw him die, who saw him raised from the dead, who preached that message even in the face of threats of death and jail and punishment. And they never backed off of that, which means they believed it. And so that convinces me that this is a historical fact. And so the resurrection is the sign. I mean, there's lots of signs in the Bible, but that's the one that proves it all right there. And if the resurrection is true, the whole Bible is true. If the resurrection isn't true, then the whole Bible is false. That's how critical the resurrection of Jesus is. But the whole point, I went through all of that because it was kind of interesting to me. But to get to that verse 21, he was speaking of the temple of his body. So sometimes the guy just tells you. He's not talking literally here. He's not talking about Herod's temple with the stones. That's not what he's going to raise up in 3 days. Although, being God, you reckon Jesus could have done that? Yeah, oh yeah. I imagine he could have raised that temple in 1 second if he wanted to. You know, he could have tore it down and raised it up if he wanted to. But the point is, John makes it very clear he's speaking figuratively here. The temple of his body. Another passage where the Bible tells us it's figurative, over in Galatians 4. And the book of Galatians and the book of Hebrews, both, two entire books, and then there's other passages to add to that in other books. But the entire book of Galatians, the entire book of Hebrews, the whole point of those two books is to show you that there's a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's the whole point of those two books, which is why it boggles my mind that people today still struggle with that. I think we're still under the old law. I think we can do things under the law like they did. How can you, when you've got two whole books in the New Testament that are designed for the very purpose of telling you that the Old Testament and the New Testament are two separate things, and you can't be under them both at the same time. But in chapter 4, he uses a big extended figure to describe this, starting with, let's go back to verse 21 for context. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, he's talking about the Old Testament law, the law of Moses. You who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons. What were his two sons' names? Yeah, Ishmael and Isaac, that's right. Ishmael was, he says, one by the bondwoman, that was Ishmael, and the other by the free woman, that was Sarah's son, that's Isaac. Okay, so he had two sons, that's written in the Bible. Just as an aside, nothing to do with this text at all, but who today are the descendants of the Ishmaelites? Yeah, the Arabs. The Muslims. They're the descendants of the Ishmaelites. That's why to this very day they still fight over there. Okay, and Isaac, his descendants are the Jews. Okay, so Abraham had two sons, one by a bondwoman, the other by a free. But he who was born of the bondwoman was born according to flesh, and he of the free woman through promise. What promise is he talking about? Yeah, the seed of Abraham, the seed promise, that in thy seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Verse 24, these things are what? Symbolic. I think the old King James says an allegory. And the idea is, I'm not speaking literally now, even though Abraham was literal and Isaac was literal and Ishmael was literal and all, but he says, I'm using that as a symbol to get across something else here. These two things are symbolic, for they represent the two covenants, Old and New, Old Testament, New Testament. The one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Which covenant is that? The Old Covenant, that's right. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. That's where the law came down. The law of Moses came down on Mount Sinai. And corresponds to the Jerusalem which now is, the physical Jerusalem on the earth, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above, there's the heavenly Jerusalem, okay, is free and the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, O barren. Remember, Sarah was barren. She couldn't have children, but God said she's going to have them. Even though she's 90 years old, she's going to have a child. Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear, break forth and shout, you who are not in labor, for the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now, brethren, we, as Isaac was, are children of promise. We're of the Christian covenant. But as he who was born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, Isaac, even so it is now. So you have Jews persecuting Christians in this context. Well, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. What he's saying is that's the old law. Cast it out. That's the old law. We're not under that anymore, you see. So then, verse 31, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. We don't belong under the law of Moses. But notice, he took something that was literal, Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and he turned it into, as he calls it, an allegory, or my New King James says symbolic. He turns it into a figurative symbol. But he tells us these things are symbolic. I'm using this symbolically here to get across the point. Okay? So it's helpful. It's most helpful when the writer just comes out and says, pay attention, this is not literal. That really helps. They don't always do that, but that really helps a lot. So sometimes they just tell us it's figurative. Okay. Let me stop there, see if there are any questions or comments before I go any further. Okay. Next thing on the list. Sometimes the definite is put for the indefinite, and that's how we know he's speaking figuratively. Matthew 18, I think that's the verse I got. Yeah. Matthew 18, verse 22. This is a parable about forgiveness. The whole chapter has to do a lot with that, about restoring relationships and forgiveness of sins. And you remember this is the famous chapter where Jesus said in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go tell everybody else in the country what he did. Is that what Jesus said? Go to him directly and personally, face to face. So you got that. I'm just giving you the background here. And then you come down here to verse 21, and Jesus said, well, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And I'm sure Peter thought, well, that's a lot. And Jesus said, I do not say up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And that's another hyperbole, an exaggeration to make a point. 70 times 7. literally is 490. But you sin against me 491 times and we're done. I don't think that's what Jesus means. He's just taking the number 7 and expanding it 70 times, saying that forgiveness has no limits. It needs to go on and on and on. You can't put a number on it. But to make his point, he exaggerates. And we do that with our kids. You know, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. And it probably hasn't been 1,000, but we say that to make our point. And Jesus is saying that up to 70 times 7. Hopefully you won't have to forgive somebody 490 times. Hopefully they straighten up and act a little better so you don't have to forgive them 490 times. Hopefully they learn a lesson long before then. But he's exaggerating to make the point that forgiveness goes on and on and on. And so the definite 490 is put, but he doesn't mean literally 490. He just means an indefinite number of times. You forgive as often as it's necessary. And then from there he launches into that parable. How often does God forgive us? Every time we ask. Yeah, ain't that something? His children, by the way. Every time we ask, I forgive you, I forgive you. And of course, we have to repent. We have to meet his conditions. But every time we repent and ask, and how many times have you had to say, forgive me, to God? I lost count years ago. It's been a lot of times I've had to grovel before God and say, God, I'm sorry, I blew it again. And he forgives me every time, see. And so that was the whole point of the chapter. But 70 times 7, the definite, 490, is put for the indefinite.
We as Christians, we would really, we slough it. We think we have to forgive somebody over and over and over. But what if God felt like that toward us?
Yes.
When we come to him.
Yeah.
How many times?
Yeah. And I've even made that point in a little bit different way. You know, we ask God 50 times a day. I'm just throwing that number out there. We ask God 50 times a day, God, forgive me for that ugly little thought or that little word that slipped out. And then we have the audacity to say to our brother, you didn't shake my hand. I'm not ever forgiving you for that one little transgression or whatever. And who in the world do we think we are? Who in the world do we think we are when we act like that? We think we're better than God. That's what we're really saying. I think I'm better. God forgive me 100,000 times, but I ain't forgiven you not even once. And that's just not right. That's just not right.
Yeah. 10,000, and then he went after the guy that only owed him
whatever it was, 30 or 100. Yeah, it was 100 denarii. That's right. And he just wouldn't forgive. That's not going to work. Okay. Another thing. And all we're doing here is just showing you how to recognize figurative language. That's the whole point of all this. Sometimes things are said in mockery. I put Acts 2. We'll get to Acts 2 in a second, but I want to go to 1 Kings 18. That's on your page. I only had room for so many scriptures up here. So 1 Kings 18, this is kind of interesting. You got the Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Baal. And there was a big confrontation, and they put the sacrifices out there. They said, let's find out who the real God is. You put your sacrifice out there and you cry out to Baal and see if he'll ignite that sacrifice. And we'll put ours over here and we'll cry out to Jehovah and we see who ignites the sacrifice. And for good measure, while we're over here with Jehovah, let's pour some water on it. Lots of water. Oh, that's not enough. Pour more water on it. And, of course, they're crying out to Baal. And what happens? Nothing, because he's not a real God. They cry out to Jehovah. What happens? And it licks up the water, the gallons upon gallons of water, and ignites the sacrifice and the whole thing. And that was to prove who was God. But in the course of that, in 1 Kings 18 and verse 27, this is kind of funny. So it was at noon. Well, let me back up here. Verse 25. I want you to see the context. Elijah had said to the prophets of Baal, choose one bull for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many. And call upon the name of your God, but put no fire under it. So they took the bull which was given to them, and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. Kind of reminds you a little bit of these Pentecostals and charismatics. They're leaping and hollering and shouting and hooting and nothing's happening, okay? And so it was at noon. Here it comes. Elijah mocked them. He's having fun with this. Cry out loud. He is a God. Why, either he's meditating, or he's busy, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's sleeping and must be awakened, and he's just making fun. Maybe your God fell asleep. Maybe your God's on a trip. Maybe your God, and the New King James says he's busy. Does anybody have a different translation there? Thinking it over.
Literally,
Where it says he's busy, literally, he's relieving himself. Remember me telling you about some of the colorful language of the Bible? Here's one of them right here. Maybe your God's over in the bathroom somewhere. Maybe you need to get him out of the bathroom, come out here and light that sacrifice. He's just mocking this guy. And so the point I'm making is Elisha doesn't think this God is real. He doesn't think that they can wake him up. He doesn't think they can drag him out of the bathroom. What's he really think? He doesn't even exist. Your God's a phony. Okay? But he's mocking. So when he's doing that mocking, he's not trying to say, I think Baal is real and you just need to wake him up. He's not being literal here, but he's speaking very mocking tones and making fun of their false god. Okay? And so sometimes when there's mockery, we know that they're not speaking literally, because Baal was not a real god at all. He wasn't busy because he doesn't even exist. Okay. I'm looking at the clock there. Another passage, Acts 2. This is an interesting one. This was another one where it's said in mock, I think, because of the context. The Holy Spirit fell upon the apostles, and the people began to accuse them. Let's back up here to verse 5. I know it's a long way back, but there were Jews dwelling in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. When this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused, because everyone heard them speak in his own language. They're all speaking in tongues. And they were all amazed, and they marveled, and saying, Look, are not all these who speak Galileans? And how is it that we hear each one in our language in which we were born? Skipping ahead to verse 12, in the middle there's all the places they came from. So they were all amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, Whatever could this mean? And others, mocking, said they're full of new wine. So they're mocking the apostles. Oh, they're drunk. That's why they're speaking in tongues. They're drunk. Now listen to Peter's reply, verse 14. Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice, and he said, Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and heed my words, for these are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the third hour of the day. Think about that. Can you not get drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning? Sure you can. You can get drunk anytime you want to. So he's mocking them right back. They mock him. He said, Well, it's too early. It's only the third hour. And so he's mocking them right back. They're mocking him. In fact, new wine actually won't make you drunk. We talked about that. New wine it's the non-alcoholic wine. It's the freshly squeezed. And so they're mocking the apostles, and he just fires right back at them. He said, It's too early for us to be that drunk. So you can literally get drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning, the third hour. So if you took it literally, it wouldn't make any sense. You can get drunk any time of the day or night. 9 o'clock's got that. There's nothing about 9 o'clock that keep a person from getting drunk. But he's just firing the mockery right back at them, you see. So that's how you know that he's not speaking literally, because the apostles, you reckon they drank? Not like that. Not in the sense of getting drunk. That certainly wasn't the case. All right. Looking at the clock, got a minute or two left. Let me see if I can get another one in here. The last one. D8 on your note. Sometimes just plain old common sense will tell us it's figurative. John 4. Jesus talking with the woman at the well, verses 10 to 15. He passed through Samaria on purpose, In fact, if you look at verse 9, the Jews, it says in the last part of verse 9, the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. The Samaritans were considered less by the Jews. This was a racial prejudice because they weren't purebred Jews. They had mixed it up with the people of the land, and so they dwelt in Samaria, and the Jews kind of didn't want nothing to do with those people. And of course, Jesus comes to break down all those barriers. Stop that stuff thinking you're better than somebody else because you don't descend from the same people. What's the matter with you? Okay? Jesus comes to break down those barriers. And that's why he goes through Samaria on purpose, so he can sit down and talk to this Samaritan woman that nobody else will talk to. The Jews won't talk to him because they think they're better than they are. So he sits down and talks to this Samaritan woman, and he'd asked her in verse 7, give me a drink. Okay? And verse 9, the woman said, well, why are you asking me for a drink? You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan. I thought we didn't talk to one another. And so Jesus says in verse 10, if you knew the gift of God and who it is says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked and he would have given you living water. Well, I don't even know what that is. Living water? I don't even know what that is. But he's speaking figuratively, and it should be obvious. Water is water. Okay? It might be clean, it might be dirty, but it's H2O. Okay? The woman said, sir, you have nothing to draw with. You don't have any buckets. And the well is deep. Where are you going to get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? And Jesus said, whoever drinks of this water in the well will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst. Never thirst. Clearly, he's not talking about physical water now. He's shifted gears. And he's talking about some other kind of water, spiritual water, living water. That's what he means by living water. The water I give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up to everlasting life. And the woman said, sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. So Jesus has taken the water that the literal water that she was coming to draw to feed the livestock and to feed her family, and making an application to spiritual water, where your thirst will be quenched. Your spiritual hunger, your spiritual thirst, you see. So it becomes clear, you'll never thirst. He can't be talking about literal water, because you can drink a glass of literal water and about 30 minutes later you're thirsty again. He's talking about something else. Okay, I see I've gone a minute or two over, so I'll hush right there. We'll pick up number 2 right where we left off in 1 week.